5, 6, 7, 8.
Hi EXers, welcome to the EX podcast episode number 43. This is your host, Stefan Vincent. I've started this podcast because I believe that companies have to think of themselves as employment brands if they hope to attract and retain talents. This podcast brings a different lens to the employee experience, a brand and customer experience perspective rather than a traditional HR perspective. Our guests, all thought leaders and disruptors in the EX space in their own way, come to this show to debate, discuss and share best practices on the key components that foster employee engagement and strengthen company culture, and also to spark the conversation on how to create positive employee experiences. One size doesn't fit all. What Airbnb or Google do around the employee experience may simply not be applicable in a smaller company. This is what this show is all about, sharing stories of companies of all sizes, not only to show that EX doesn't require a large budget or a large team, but also that there isn't one recipe. Each company can find its own way through the EX journey. Today's guest is Matt Burns, Human Resources Director, CHRO at JYSK. Matt leads a team of 22 human resources professionals tasked with supporting 63 Canadian retail locations, a rapidly expanding e-commerce offering, 3 distribution centers, and their corporate offices. Today with Matt, we will talk about why and how Matt transformed a traditional HR function in an automated and completely paperless function. We also talk about how to drive employee engagement in an industry where turnover is traditionally high, how his team has implemented a robust HR analytics suite to drive strategic talent and business decisions, and what diversity and inclusion means at JYSK. This episode is brought to you by Fusion Alliance. Fusion Alliance delivers holistic solutions fusing together data, digital and technology to redefine customer experiences and move your ideas to execution. That's why businesses across multiple industries have relied on Fusion's expertise and partnership for over 25 years. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Matt. If you get a chance, please make sure to review the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, or YouTube. And last thing, if you want to send me feedback, suggestions for future topics or guests, you can reach me at svincent@exsummit.com or on Twitter at @EX_summit. Alright, let's get to it. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the EX podcast. Today's guest is calling from Vancouver in British Columbia. His name is Matt Burns and he is the Human Resources Director and CHRO at a company called JYSK. Matt, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Stephen.
To kick it off, tell us a bit more about your background and what is JYSK?
Sure, I'd be happy to. My background is I've been in the corporate world for about 20 years now. I've had the opportunity to work in a number of functions. I started out in operations, though I've had stints in marketing, and most recently, for the last almost 15 years, in human resources. JYSK is a Danish retailer with a global presence. We sell home furnishings, mattresses, and home decor, and I have the privilege of working for the Canadian franchisee for that business.
So how many stores do you have around the world?
Oh, wow. We are over 2,500 stores around the world right now, but the Canadian operation that I support is just north of 60 stores.
Okay. Across the entire country?
That's correct.
So you joined JYSK with a sort of blank canvas to shape the HR function. And obviously, this kind of opportunity doesn't happen very often. So what was the process like to define what the HR function should be within the organization?
That's a really good question. And I think your point is well taken. A lot of HR professionals would certainly love the opportunity to start with a blank canvas and certainly have the support that we had here at JYSK. When I joined the organization, really, I'd received a lot of feedback from our board and our ownership group here that where some of the pain points had been with the organization in the past, and specifically we were primed for rapid growth, and the organization realized that we needed a strong HR function to enable that growth going forward. So my process really was to intake as much feedback as I could from as many stakeholder groups as possible. The ownership group and our board, of course, were two key stakeholder groups, but they weren't the only ones. I spent a lot of time, actually upwards of 4 months in our business, traveling across the country here in Canada, speaking to colleagues in a number of locations, and also focused on our corporate offices and distribution centers to understand some of their pain points, and then that, combined with my experiences and some of the things I had seen as far as industry best practices, was used to create our strategy, which we then started to implement in early 2016.
So what was the process to go through meeting all those different stakeholders, identify the pain points? How did you do that? And then what came out of those meetings and interviews and conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not that complicated from my perspective. Really, it's you ask people how things are, and you talk to them about the function that I support, which is human resources, and you attempt to assess a couple things. First is I want to assess their understanding of the human resources function in the broader context, but also how they see it at our organization, just to ensure that as we create our strategy, that it's going to be aligned with expectations. At the same time, we ensure that we ask the same questions repeatedly. So I had kind of a script, if you will. I didn't bring it with me and have a piece of paper in front of me, but I knew the 3 or 4 questions that I wanted to ask every single person. And then I would change other questions based on the individual and the audience that I was speaking to, but allowing to have the consistency between those 3 and 4 questions allowed me to establish a baseline and then come back with some quantifiable evidence. So when I was able to present my findings to our board, I was able to say, I spoke with this many individuals and this percentage of individuals found this as a pain point or this is a priority, and it provided a real quantitative measure of the feedback. At the same time, the feedback that we received from the colleagues was very consistent with the feedback that I received from our board, and therefore it was a pretty easy sell because a lot of the things the board surfaced as being areas of opportunity or areas of focus were also areas that were felt by the colleagues in the business. So the process really was around meeting with individuals in a safe environment, having conversations, and really asking those baseline questions. The one other piece that I'll mention, Stephen, that I think is important to touch on is I also spent a bit of time talking a bit about me and about what I was all about, and a bit about how I saw my process and how I saw the outputs coming. Because as you can appreciate, for an operational audience, they may have visitors come to their store on a semi-regular basis. And I wanted them to ensure that this visit wasn't like other visits, that I was really interested in hearing their feedback directly from them, and that we would take their feedback to heart and use it to build our strategy. So that was why it was so important for us to not only gather their feedback, but also once we had developed the strategy, to go back to the business and say, here's the outcome of your feedback and here's what we're going to do based on it.
Does HR in Canada operate differently from the HR departments in Europe?
Yes. And it does in a number of ways. So a couple things that I've seen just in terms of the Canadian market versus the European market. The adoption of technology is much greater in Europe than it is in Canada, and in particular in Western Europe. And the lens that I'm saying that with is the retail industry. There's a lot of innovation in retail, in technology, specifically in the UK, as well as other parts of Western Europe in terms of the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, that I speak with on a pretty semi-regular basis. So I think in that way, they're a bit different. Also, of course, each of those countries has their own unique labor laws, whether it's EU laws or individual country laws that do cause HR to have to interact differently with the business. That being said, I would say Canada's legislation in that regard is actually a closer match to European regulation than it might be actually to the US.
So you joined, JYSK has a singular vision to eliminate repetitive administrative tasks in favor of automation. And obviously technology has a big role to play in that. And from what we discussed when we had a prep call, this in turn allowed the team to spend more time and have more freedom to coach, to support, and to counsel their internal customers, which are the employees. And the ultimate goal was to go to a paperless HR function. So what was the process like, and what results have you reached or gotten so far?
Yeah, and I'm happy to answer those questions. Maybe just let me have a chance to step back and talk a bit about why we decided to go with automation. Because we started with a blank canvas, and because we had such a large mandate ahead of us, we were really standing up an HR organization for a company that had been operating for close to 20 years without really a strong strategic HR influence. So we had to really insert ourselves into the organization seamlessly. And I often refer to it as, building the plane while you're flying it. The business is operating, and we have to find some way to kind of merge into the lane, if you will. And how we did that through automation was really critical. As we looked at the needs of the services that the business would need from us going forward, and the type of mandate that we would have to accomplish in order for us to have success within the context of the organization's strategy, it was clear to me that despite the fact we were going to get an infusion of resources, those resources alone were not going to allow us to achieve our mandate. Having said that, technology and the automation of transactional HR tasks would allow us the best of both worlds, in that it would allow us to reduce or eliminate all that manual repetitive administration and replace it with automation, and therefore we could leverage the finite amount of resources that we had into that future-facing, into that forward-looking activity that was more solutions-focused and root cause-focused, and spend less time reacting and managing transactional tasks. So the process for us really around that was to identify where those pain points were from an administration perspective, and you don't have to go very far in HR to find them. We are an administrative function, we are a support function, so really any touch point with the associate in our business is an opportunity for us to have administration. So we really followed the trajectory of the employment life cycle. So everything from when a candidate applies from a job all the way through to selection, orientation, training, and then also their time in the organization. And we looked for all the touch points where HR integrated with the business. We looked for the processes, and if they were manual, we automated them. And if there was nothing present, we added an automated process. And then the result of that was we're about 95% paperless today. We will be 100% paperless probably within the next quarter. And that's just because we've been spending time working with third-party stakeholders trying to digitize their forms. So we do interact with the government, liaise with the government, and trying to make sure that their processes are also digital so we can do some integrations on that. So we're just closing up a couple of loose ends, but we should be ready to go within the next quarter.
How many employees do you have in Canada?
About 1,500. I mean, we're retail, so we do ebb and flow based on the season, but 1,500 is a pretty good guess.
And it's always a challenge to get a high level of engagement from employees in retail because of the seasonality, as you said, because of usually a high turnover. So what is the turnover rate, if you can share that with us at JYSK, and what type of response do you get from retail or store employees on whatever EX initiatives that JYSK is experimenting in Canada?
Yeah, so what I can say so far as our numbers, I mean, we are a privately held company, so while I'm not able to disclose the actual figure, what I can tell you is that our turnover is below the industry average because we do benchmark ourselves against the reporting that the retail industry puts forward here in Canada. And we think that's largely because of our business structuring philosophy. I mean, we do have Scandinavian roots, so for us, family is really important to how we operate our business and certainly how we interact with our colleagues in our stores and in our DCs and in our offices. I think you mentioned two really key drivers to why it's difficult to engage retail employees. Seasonality is absolutely one. And what I would add to that conversation is just the nature of an operational environment takes away some of the flexibility that we have to engage with our colleagues. So I'll give you an example. If you're working in a retail environment or a manufacturing environment, something that's very, very heavily operational, it's unlikely the majority of those workplaces will allow employees to carry their cell phones with them on the sales floor or on the shop floor. It could be a safety reason, it could be a productivity reason, it could be a customer service issue, all of which make a ton of sense from an operational perspective. From an engagement perspective, it places some real significant barriers in front of people like myself as we attempt to communicate and engage with our colleagues. And specifically with younger generations who've grown up with almost a smartphone in their hand and have an expectation around the transparency and the engagement of business, it places a real challenge in front of us, because how do we get the information to a dispersed remote audience that may not have access to technology on a minute-by-minute basis? And the way we solve for that, Stephen, is we try and create as many different channels as possible where employees can not only have access to the information when we push it, but they can also pull the information. So a couple of examples with that would be we have created and we do have a number of employee-led kind of councils that we use to, one, solicit feedback from colleagues, but also at the same time socialize initiatives that we have in the business for their feedback. And we take pride in the fact that we don't launch initiatives in our business without running them through those councils, so that we get that feedback and we can operationalize it to ensure it's the right fit for our business and our customer. The second thing we do, like most organizations, of course, is we do have an employee survey that we do run. But what I would say is our approach to engagement may be a bit unique in that I've taken a very hard stance on data that comes from our engagement survey, and frankly, data that comes from the HR function, period. And the kind of the catchphrase, if you will, that I've been using here in the organization and has gotten some traction on social media is, we use data at JYSK to illuminate, not to punish. And what I mean by that is, specifically with measures like engagement or sales or profit, for me, these are all lagging measures in that they're the result of a number of other behaviors that precede them that may or may not be under the influence of the four walls of an individual worksite. So what we do as a result of that is we communicate to our business and say, so we have an engagement number, maybe the number is 70%. That's a great starting point. Let's unpack how we got to the 70%. Let's have a conversation about the 70% in the context of your historical performance, and also how the industry and how the company is performing, and just see and benchmark that. The second step we go through is we contextualize the feedback, because, of course, one of the big risks of dealing with macro data that comes from a survey, especially when you have standardized questions, is that it's very hard to suss out nuance in how people respond to very generic questions. So we again go back to key stakeholder groups in the business through town hall meetings and through smaller focus groups, and we put the question and the result back to those groups. And through confidentiality, we ask them to help us understand and define what this question meant for that particular stakeholder group, so that when we develop our action plans, we're doing so with the partnership of the employees, and that we're not assuming that we know what they need and then developing programs that maybe misalign with their expectations. One thing I found in managing engagement programs for the better part of 10 years now is there's two things that you can do to quickly derail your engagement. The first thing is you can ask for feedback and then do nothing with it.
Yes.
You're better served just not to do anything at all than to ask for feedback with no intentions of actually doing something with it. And the second thing that you can do to derail your engagement is you can ask for feedback and then assume that you can infer the answer from the result and then develop the solution for somebody else. Because if you get it wrong, then it's the same thing. People think you haven't listened, you don't understand, and it just furthers the disengagement in the business. So it's really important that you not only do the step of getting the survey information, but take the extra steps to ensure you contextualize it with all your key stakeholder groups so that you develop the right solutions and preferably partner with them on the solutioning process.
How often do you run that survey?
Right now, we do it annually. I would like to see it increased in cadence going forward. We're actually right now in discussions with a couple of vendors around increasing the frequency of our survey process, and with a view to us going on a roadmap to trying to find new ways to engage the colleagues. As I mentioned, specifically communications is a big challenge in a retail environment, so we're trying to find ways to bring those two things together, and how do we get more frequent feedback, maybe in smaller pieces, so that we can take quicker action. Because again, a limitation with an annual survey is that about 3 weeks after the survey results, the information's out of date. So we have to, then we have to wait 11 more months to come back and ask people for their opinions again. We're trying to find ways to be a bit more nimble and therefore have more frequent touch points with our colleagues.
It sounds like from what you said that you have identified different segments of employees. Mm-hmm. Do you guys have different initiatives around employee experience, employee engagements, maybe training and developments that address those different employee segments?
We do. And full disclosure, for my consultant friends, I apologize in advance for making this statement. I find a lot of times with engagement, we end up overcomplicating it. Mm-hmm. So engagement for me is really, really simple. You ask people for their opinions. You demonstrate authenticity and a genuine desire to want to hear their opinions. You then take the feedback. You mirror it back to them and establish that you actually understand it for what it means for that group of people or that individual. You take action against the feedback, and sometimes the action can be that we're not taking action. But whatever you've done, whether it's inaction or you've taken substantive steps, you need to communicate that back to your stakeholder group on an ongoing update basis. And as you are, quote unquote, crossing things off your list, you want to take time to celebrate those with your employees. I don't spend a lot of time segmenting our groups into various stakeholder groups by age, by gender, because I don't think it's relevant other than it's another employee group within our business. I think it's important that for every group, and we generally segment them by geography or by role in the organization. And what we would do in those cases is just, again, present that feedback to them in terms of how this stakeholder group answered some questions. And then we give them the opportunity to give us the context behind it. I find a lot of organizations really overcomplicate the engagement process and almost feel a pressure to develop really complicated, fancy, cool programs. And a lot of times those programs look really great on paper, but if they aren't actually realized and you don't actually complete all the steps in that design, then again, you're better served not to do anything. So I pride myself in this organization of taking a more simplistic view of the world. We get the feedback, we parrot it back to the individuals, we ask for the feedback and make sure we have hit the mark, and then we take action, we get results, and we make sure that we communicate all along the process that we've got it right. We ask for feedback along the way, and then we partner with the employees to develop the solutions together. I think a big risk of organizations developing solutions for their employees, besides the aforementioned concern about getting the answer right, is that if the organization positions itself as the solution to this problem, you're not enabling the employees to help you fix it. And then it creates a dynamic where people expect the organization to come and say, fix all of our problems for us. A lot of the problems with engagement, and a lot of the great things about engagement, and in this thread, I'm thinking, Stephen, about a recent study that I read and something I've been talking about lately on social media. There's a strong correlation between friendships at work and employee engagements. So I think in that context, the organization has a responsibility to create the conditions and the environment that allows relationships to form, but ultimately we can't govern every relationship in the business. And that's where employees can help us by creating feedback and giving us that feedback so that we can create those environments so that when we create the constructs that allow for good relationships, we then get out of the employee's way and let them do the jobs that they were supposed to do. And ultimately, I find that as little barriers as you put in front of employees to have those conversations and to engage in relationships, the more thankful they are and the faster they develop.
Could you share with us specifically some programs that you've put in place to engage with your employees?
Yeah, I mentioned one previously, which was the focus groups that I mentioned and the councils. Another thing that we've done recently to increase the engagement of our employees was we've completely revamped our learning and development programs to allow a more interactive process. So traditionally what would have happened with our learning and development programs was we would provide essentially a lecture where we would essentially broadcast information that was related to somebody's job. There really wasn't a lot of group interaction, and it was very hard to scale because we were not using technology. Mm-hmm. We've now implemented technology, and it allows us to do a couple of things. One, scale the training in a very large country like Canada, which allows for multiple participants now through technology to participate in the same training program simultaneously. Two, allows us to scale our training efforts so that trainers don't have to physically visit work sites to deliver training, but rather can do so centrally through technology. And therefore, we can address training needs much more promptly. Whereas before, it was we were often handcuffed by our schedules in terms of travel, in terms of availability of people. So now we have the ability to offer training at a time that makes sense for employees. And at the same time, we record all of our training. So if individuals cannot make the session because, again, in an operational environment, the customer always needs to be priority. If they're not able to join us for a live session because of a customer requirement or some need in a work site, what we would then do is have the recorded content available for that manager so they can still access the same learning and still participate in that experience. So that's one example, Stephen, of how we've revamped it. But I would say there's a number of structural examples that we've done, everything from compensation changes and looking at our benefit programs to changes to learning and development. But I think, if I was to look at one of the biggest reasons that we've been able to move the needle on engagement, it's been a real demonstrated genuine attempt to try and increase two-way communication. Historically, our communication has been very one-sided, coming from the business and being broadcasted to our operational audience. I've tried to increase as many different vehicles as possible to have the employees be able to give us feedback, so there's a reciprocation.
It's very common in organizations to have a top-down communication versus a two-way communication. One big challenge that many organizations face is how do you measure the success of employee experience initiatives or company culture? How can you measure the impact, if any, on the business and business outcomes or business performance? I would imagine that in retail you have some easy KPIs to put in place, such as if you do customer satisfaction surveys when people come to the stores and try to evaluate their experience in the stores, interacting with the staff, or maybe it's in terms of sales generated within the stores. Do you have such KPIs in place?
Yes, we do. I mean, within our HR department, we have a scorecard and a metric dashboard that has 76 unique data points all across the business. But the reason we have so many is really there's two reasons. The first one is that each of those measures that you've talked about, whether it's sales, whether it's customer satisfaction, whether it is turnover, all those are very easy metrics to correlate between the employee experience and the number itself. But again, the risk of doing so and looking at a very narrow lens is each of those measures can also be explained by a number of other factors that have nothing to do with the employee experience. So what we're cautious about is in drawing a correlation where one doesn't exist, and rather to offset that risk, we try and pull as many unique data points as possible, because if they're all pointing in the same direction and telling the same story, then we know we have something. But again, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important for us that we use the data to illuminate and to use it as an impetus for additional research and due diligence and conversations with our employees. We don't jump to action and take a result based on a lagging metric. So that for us is a critical part of it. From a measurement perspective, we also leverage, and the reason our dashboard has increased up to 76, we've created during the hiring process, because we identified early on that one of the key pain points of our employee experience took place in the first 90 days of employment, which again is not a problem that's unique to JYSK. The first 90 days, the new colleague in our business is assessing whether or not they made the right decision to join our organization, as we're making the same assessments on their candidacy and their first 90 days in the organization. And we found that there was a disproportionately large number of people that were leaving in the first 90 days relative to what I would expect given our other turnover numbers. So what we did was we now have inputted multiple very short surveys during the new hire process, where we actually engage new hires 3 to 4 times in their first 90 days with a really quick survey to say, how is it going? Did we meet the expectations of your onboarding? Is the job in reality what we said it would be during the hiring process? Is your manager spending time with you and talking about your development? I mean, we have a series of kind of templated questions, and we provide those to every single employee by way of automated surveys that they then receive. They provide us with feedback so far as how things are going, 1 week after they were hired, 4 weeks after they were hired, 3 months after they were hired, and then we are able to assess within the first 90 days where there could be a breakdown. And the results of that survey told us that we have great engagement in the first 30 days. It's day 31 to day 89 where things seem to fall off. So we were able to then, through illumination, narrow our focus from day 31 to day 89 and really dig into, with those individuals who provide that exit interview feedback and also the onboarding feedback, what happened on day 31 or day 42 or day 67, help us understand what that looks like. And then we were able to build targeted action plans to solve some of those gaps from a program perspective.
So do you oversee everything that is that revolves around HR, from recruiting to purely HR administrative tasks to mentoring and coaching, learning and development? Do you oversee all of those different responsibilities?
I do, and I also have the privilege of also overseeing internal communications and occupational health and safety.
Okay, so I guess it's easier in your organization to have a consistent experience across all those different phases of an employee journey through the organization, because in many organizations you have different departments or different teams that are responsible for those different stages. Recruiting may not be aligned to HR, or employee branding may not be aligned to human resources. And then when you hand over a brand new employee after the onboarding process, how long it is, then it goes to the manager's responsibility to maintain that consistency around the experience, which is always a challenge as well. So how are you able to manage that consistency in the experience, and also sort of to manage the fluctuation of expectations from employees when they come on board to when they hit the floor and they work in the stores, interact with the customers, and even maybe after a year or two, they may have aspirations to move to a management role or to a role with higher responsibilities. So how do you manage all those different fluctuations in aspirations and expectations?
Yeah, and it's a challenge. I mean, and I don't know that we've been able to solve that problem entirely. Let me go back to your first point, and then I'll trace my way back to the kind of your final comment. So far as getting alignment within the HR function, I can provide you a perspective from 2 points. So yes, I do have the privilege of overseeing the entire HR function, and that does lend itself to greater alignment because I have a singular strategy that my team helped develop and therefore helps support execute, and that makes it easier. Having said that, not everyone around the table who develops that strategy are the individuals who are often interfacing with our employees on a day-to-day basis. And we do have, at various times, misalignment between direction and strategy and what actually happens because of a number of factors that may or may not be within our control. I can provide this answer from 2 vantage points. So within the CHRO role, what I would offer, and from that perspective, is that yes, we do spend time to ensure that we're all aligned around a singular purpose. So that is absolutely part of the mandate and something we do pride ourselves on. That being said, while I can control to a certain degree that the programs from HR have one sight, one sound, are consistent, the moment we partner with other groups, and you mentioned, of course, line managers in this context, there is some risk because we're now introducing a new player into the equation that may not have the same beliefs, values, and strategies that we have related to that. And when I say strategies, I don't necessarily mean that they aren't aligned with the strategy, but their priorities might be different. So in an operating environment, you're often having to work with limited resources in a very dynamic, unpredictable place. And that means that your schedule is constantly being rejuggled. And when you have fixed activities like onboarding and training, sometimes those things can suffer because of operational requirements. So while we can manage the program execution and make sure the programs are consistent, and that, to your point, talent acquisition has the same vision of the truth as learning and development and the same as compensation and benefits, we do have some other groups that we do kind of liaise with. Having said that, I think it's equally important that you link performance measures within the HR team to some of those behaviors. So I'll give you an example. Within our organization, I challenge talent acquisition with turnover in the first 90 days. And when I say challenge, I mean this. part of their metrics that I use to assess their performance is turnover in the first 90 days.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, I have talent acquisition do all the exit interviews for any manager that leaves this company in the first 90 days. And the reason being is I want them to hear from the candidates directly where the failure points were in our process. And my contention is that in the majority of cases that somebody leaves in the first 90 days, it's often a function of fit. It's not a function necessarily maybe of performance or compensation. It's usually a function of, I thought the role was this, it's actually this. This is not what I signed up for. I need to find something else to do. Especially in the management roles, people don't make decisions like that lightly. So we must have really had a misalignment between what we thought the role was or what the candidate thought the role was and what it ended up being. So I reinforce the importance of the socialization process and taking the time to spend with the candidate to understand the role and our company culture, the good stuff, but also some of the pain points, because every organization has pain points. And I think it's really important, especially in leadership roles, to be transparent about those pain points so that the individual can decide for themselves, do I want to sign up for this challenge, or would I prefer a different challenge or no challenge at all? And if they choose option B or C, they will find that maybe this organization isn't the right fit for them at this time. The other vantage point I can give you is in my previous role before I joined JYSK, I worked for an organization called Walmart. And the role that I supported, I actually sat in kind of a center of excellence in between the quote unquote specialists, which for those who aren't familiar with the term would be talent acquisition, training and development, compensation, all the folks in the quote unquote corporate office that were developing programs. I sat between them and the field-based generalists that were executing those programs that were developed in the office. And my role really was to bring those two groups together to solve for what we just talked about, which is sometimes a misalignment between operational HR and strategic HR. And in that case, it was exactly the same principles, which was get those two parties into the room, have a conversation, give an opportunity for the field-based folks to give feedback to the designers so that they could conceptualize programs in the future and right-size them for an operational audience, and to give the designers an opportunity to liaise with the field-based resources so that they could identify what some of the risks would be if the field was to adopt the programs without having that be sanctioned by the designers, and explain some of the consequences of that. And by bringing those two parties together, we were able to get alignment, create that consistency in terms of programs, and then we left the responsibility of aligning our programs with operations, with our business partners, and those field-based HR resources.
How would you define the JYSK experience, and what type of profiles do you look for in candidates?
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about JYSK is that we are a family, or our origins are a family company. We're a Scandinavian organization, and even the franchisee here in Canada, it's owned by a gentleman who feels very strongly about family business and all the great things that are associated with that in terms of relationships, a very flat organizational structure, and that open door policy where any employee has the ability at any point in time to speak to any member of the organization. There isn't a glass ceiling. There isn't, gates that you have to go through to see individuals. Our executive team within our group, not one of us has an executive assistant, because we want to make sure that we have a direct link with our employees and that they can access us whenever they need to for questions and concerns that they would have. So I think that for us is a key part of our experience is kind of keeping that family feel in terms of how we achieve that. And then in terms of the profile of what we look for in our organization, I mean, we're a retail business, so our needs are not a lot different than other retailers in that we're looking for someone who has a bias for customer service, who has a real desire to go above and beyond to help serve our customer. In an environment where omni-channel retail is becoming more and more prevalent, especially here in Canada, where you have online business and brick and mortar business, when you have a customer that walks through the front door of your business, you really have to differentiate on their experience as well. So we really spend time thinking about employee experience in the context of customer experience, and how do we ensure that those two messages, if you will, are consistent. Because one thing that drives customers and employees up the wall these days is when you have a misalignment between what you say outside the organization and inside the organization. It becomes inauthentic very quickly, and people stop trusting you when that happens.
So let me ask you more of a what's going to happen next type of question. Obviously, retail is being disrupted like never before, and we just heard in the news this week that Toys R Us is shutting down other stores in the US and in other countries as well. Do you see that disruption in retail affecting companies' culture in retail companies?
Absolutely. And I mean, that's from a crystal ball perspective, it has a huge impact. And here's why. Retail traditionally is still a very manual industry. It's predicated on having a lot of resources that provide service.
Right.
In a typical retail business, it's service and production. So whether you're in hospitality, restaurant industry, or in a traditional big box retailer like a Walmart, or even a smaller retailer like JYSK, we have two core functions: the service-facing functions and the production functions. And production can look like, preparing food for a grocery store. It could be assembling furniture in a JYSK location. It could be stocking shelves. But there's a production activity and a service activity. And what you're seeing in retail is, as a number of online pure play retailers come into the market, one advantage they will have over traditional retailers is that they don't have the overheads that we have. They don't operate leases with brick and mortar. They don't have the complex organizational structures that we developed several decades ago and now are working with today. They also may not have any encumbrances around technology, whereas we may be working with legacy systems in some cases. So those individuals can join the market very, very quickly, scale very rapidly, and because of their low overheads, they're able to offer products that are consistent with our products at similar, if not lower, price points, which causes retailers in this industry to make one of two decisions. They can choose to ignore it, in which case they're going to be a price gap between what pure play retailers online will offer products for and what we would offer them for. Or we can choose to match or beat it, in which case it erodes our margin. Because again, at the end of the day, we're trying to maintain a for-profit business.
Of course.
And margin for us is important, specifically in that margin spits off cash, and it provides us with profit that we're able to reinvest back in the business and make some of the aforementioned investments in technology or supply chain or resources, which becomes hindered when you have to operate in an environment where you're competing against individuals that don't have the same overheads. And what's happening in retail now is that cycle has been going on in Canada at least for the better part of 10 years. In Europe, it happened 5 to 10 years before that. And it's been a vicious downward cycle. So as more pure play retailers join the market and place downward pressure on prices, retailers that are brick and mortar are trying to find ways to right their cost structures to compete. And what that looks like in a lot of retailers is automation. So you see things like self-serve checkouts, where there used to be a cashier bringing you through your till, and now it's a machine because the organization would rather make the investment for the technology than the human resource because it's a more cost-effective structure and way of doing that. That has a material impact on corporate culture because, as you can appreciate, if the majority of your workforce is performing transactional service and production tasks, and retailers are consistently and increasingly automating that work, it causes a lot of questions about job security and what is my role going to be as this business changes and how do we interface to meet the customer's needs. So it absolutely has an impact on culture. If I was to apply a kind of a crystal ball going forward, I don't think it would surprise anybody to hear that we're seeing a fracturing of traditional corporate cultures. And by that, I mean we're seeing more organizations, and we're certainly seeing more job candidates be interested in short-term assignments, contract assignments, freelance assignments. This whole gig economy is becoming, no longer a concept, but reality. And a lot of times organizations will leverage these resources because it provides instant value without all the commitments you need to make with a full-time permanent resource. Also, it provides additional operating flexibility that you can shift and make your business become more nimble, which is absolutely critical because change cycles are no longer occurring in 3 to 5 years, but they're happening in a matter of quarters. So if you are a business with a lot of overhead and structure and therefore limitations, it's much harder for you to make strategic changes to your business. Meanwhile, these younger upstarts that are just entering the market are fast, they're nimble, they can change on a dime, and as a result, they can run circles around some of the more established players. So all those factors all kind of play into what is a very interesting time to be in retail. You have those automation factors kind of colliding with this push around the world to kind of swing the pendulum back in favor of the employee, if you will. And recently in Canada specifically, there's been a number of legislative changes in a number of provinces which have been designed with a view to, in their opinion, introduce some balance and fairness into the employment relationship that wasn't present in the past. And those factors are colliding to cause retailers to have to adjust so that we can compete in that environment and ultimately deliver what our customers are looking for.
So you also do some cool stuff outside of JYSK as you're part of the Forbes Human Resources Council. What do you guys do on this council?
Well, full transparency, my time with the council has been quite limited. I originally joined the council because I believe very strongly that the HR profession globally needs a makeover. And when I say makeover, I don't necessarily mean we need to change the way it's positioned. I mean we need to change the way it's positioned and the way it's conceptualized. So we have some structural gaps in how HR is operated today relative to what our business needs from us. And I think that's understandable. I mean, human resources was conceptualized as personnel coming out of World War II as organizations tried to add scale and increase the size of their business units. But those business models were created at a very different time. There was no internet. Change was much slower. This was not a global economy. And therefore, the HR department of the day and of the era made a lot of sense. However, as business has evolved over the last 50 to 60 years, HR, for whatever reason, has been lagging in making the same changes that you've seen in finance and marketing and other parts of the business. And I think as a result, HR has some work to do in terms of changing its approach in how it looks at itself, but also how it interacts with the business. I viewed the Forbes Council as a means of talking about that with a global audience and to engage a cross-functional audience, because as much as I think it's important that HR redefines what it should be to business for itself, we also need input from our cross-functional partners, CEOs, CFOs, CIOs, CMOs, and COOs, to help us inform what they need from us going forward, so that when we develop this plan, and again, now you're hearing a theme between this and engagement, we need to solicit feedback from our stakeholders to ensure that what we're developing as far as our future of the profession aligns with what they need from us going forward.
So before we wrap this up, let me ask you some fun questions so that our audience can get to know you a little bit more intimately, I would say.
Sure.
If you were to pick 3 survival items to go on a deserted island, which ones would you pick?
Good questions. My wife, because everything that she touches in my life ends up being better as a result. So That would be great. She's also the outdoorsy person in our relationship, so I trust her to survive on a desert island, whereas I'm pretty sure in the first week I would eat a plant that would end up killing me. So I need her to survive. So that's first and foremost. Second off is I would love access to some sort of music player. So I know we're not going to be able to find a battery that's commercially available that allows me to run my iPhone or my iPad for 20 years, but if I could have access to music in some way, to me that's really, really important. I love music. I use it as a stress relief. I use it as a motivator. I use it at the gym. I have music playing in my ears probably close to 6 to 8 hours a day in some capacity. So for me, the access to music, even being on a desert island, would be phenomenal. And then, by the same token, I would love access to literature. I mean, I have a long list of books, of Harvard Business Review articles, of podcasts, of content that I want to consume, and I just haven't had time lately because of my corporate responsibilities here at JYSK, along with the MBA that I'm doing on the side, and then also some of these activities you talked about. So I have a long reading list. So if I could have the opportunity to have my wife, some music, and a nice long reading list to be able to consume, I could do very well on Desert Island for at least a couple of years until I get caught up.
Are you an ebook guy or a paper book guy?
I am an ebook guy. As an individual who is pushing on digitization in HR, it would be quite out of character for me to have ebooks. Here's what I would say on that. I love the idea of picking up a book and reading it on a Sunday on the couch on a rainy day in front of a fireplace. I love the romanticism around that, but ultimately I find that ebooks are more a better reflection of my life. I'm always on planes, trains, and automobiles. I'm constantly traveling. So for me, the ability to take my books with me and have access to a number of books, depending on my mood, my iPad provides a much better vehicle for that.
Okay, I could make a joke. Living in BC, I'm sure you have a lot of rainy days that you can use to read.
I do have a few rainy days here in Vancouver. That is true.
What was your dream job as a kid?
How old are we talking here? Because that answer has changed as a child.
Well, the one that you want to talk about, it can be when you were 5, when you were 10, 15.
Sure. I have a couple of odd stories for you. How's that?
Yeah, go ahead.
personal place. So a couple things. I'm the oldest of 3 sons, and I'm the oldest of 12 grandchildren. So the moment that I was born, I was destined to become a doctor, lawyer, president of the United States of America, astronaut. I mean, it was, there was a lot of pressure around me being the oldest and therefore having some success. I guess either fortunately or unfortunately, I didn't really choose any of those paths because they weren't really a good fit for my skills and weren't really where my passions have lied. But my background in terms of my childhood, I went through a number of stages where I wanted to be something or do something. A couple that stand out for me is I really was interested in high school being a litigator, being a lawyer. I loved the idea of being able to engage in discourse and influence the way the society, thinks about itself and thinks about, the future going forward, and I thought that law would be a good way of doing that. I'm also the son of a police officer, so I have a very strong, value system that's driven around justice and driven around fairness. So I saw law as being saw law as a means of being able to influence that at a larger scale. Probably the quirkiest career that I wanted to do, and I have this proof in my grade 5. I was 10 years old. My grade 5 yearbook. My father, in addition to being a police officer, was also spent a stint as a homicide detective, and that engaged him, of course, with a very misunderstood and often not talked about part of that profession. I really wanted to be a forensic pathologist. I really wanted to understand and solve mysteries about the last moments of somebody's time on this planet, with a particular emphasis on trying to solve crime and trying to bring closure to the families of people who were impacted by crime. So I would spend hours locked in my room reading books about crime scenes and about forensic pathology and the science around the human body and the experience around that, and I was really fascinated with that for many, many years, because for me, it was a combination of problem solving and also helping people. And that's ultimately what I wanted to do. And I think ultimately what led me to a career in human resources.
Yeah, that's a little different. But what is
a bit different, yeah.
A bit different, yeah. And the thing is, I know how many people actually end up doing what they were dreaming of when they were a kid.
Yeah.
You've done a couple of interesting residencies outside of Canada. You did one in Mexico City and one in Sao Paulo.
Yes.
How did you get there?
So how did I get there in terms of why I was there? It was part of an international MBA program.
Okay.
And the international MBA program included residencies in 4 international cities. In August of 2017, we met in Vancouver. We then met again in October in Sao Paulo, January of this year in Mexico City, and then we're in Nashville in 2.5 weeks to finalize our residency at Vanderbilt. What I enjoyed about that experience was, from a cross-cultural learning perspective, I have spent a lot of time working with businesses in Western Europe, also in Asia, with a particular emphasis on Southeast Asia, and a little bit of Africa, just given my previous relationship with Walmart. I had not spent a lot of time working with South America. Clearly lots of time as well in the United States, but not a lot with South America. And for me, that was a real appeal of the program, was an opportunity to immerse myself as best you can in 2.5 to 3 weeks in a culture, in a way of working, in an economy that in the case of Brazil and Mexico is definitely on the upward swing. And on top of that, I also took the opportunity in each of those cities to not only be present for my studies, which lasted, usually about 12 days to 14 days of the residencies. I tacked an extra week on each of those trips to spend time myself actually in the communities after the program to, 1, recoup from a very hectic residency schedule, but 2, to spend time with local people. And in Mexico City, I spent time with local people and actually filmed a documentary along the way. So, that was for me an opportunity to kind of explore more kind of with myself without having to follow an academic curriculum, to go meet people, network with local folks, ask them questions, and then as in Mexico City with the documentary, share that perspective with a global audience.
Awesome. I love it. So what is the way for our listeners to follow you and JYSK on social media?
Great question. Well, JYSK specifically, you can connect with us on all social media platforms. We have a Facebook presence, Twitter presence, LinkedIn presence, and I would encourage individuals that don't know us to certainly engage with us. we would appreciate that engagement. From myself, I spend far too much time, according to my wife, on LinkedIn. That's where you can find me. I'm a big believer in LinkedIn because I think the changes that the platform has made since their integration with Microsoft have been phenomenal in making a really cool social network that wouldn't have been present before. I was on LinkedIn. I've been on LinkedIn now for going on 10 years, or certainly at least more than 5. And before was really a place where you would network within your small groups of people. And most people didn't really reach outside of their networking zone. So It wasn't common to hear, if I don't know you, I'm not going to accept a connection request or things of that nature. And that still exists in some pockets today, but I would say in the last 9 months, 12 months, I've seen a major change in philosophy where now there's a big push for collaboration. There's a big push for people working together for common goals that are driven around values. So presently, I'm getting upwards of 500 connection requests every week on a light week, and most of the requests are people who want a chance to have a conversation. They want to collaborate. They have big plans, or they have a big purpose that's driving them, and they want to make a difference in this world. And they're looking for some advice or some partnership or just another set of hands to help them with that. So for me, LinkedIn's becoming that much more of a dynamic platform. So I spend most of my time on that platform. I'm on Twitter occasionally, and I do have a Facebook account that I use more for family and friends. But, in terms of LinkedIn, I'm on there at least 2 hours every single day.
And that's how we connected.
That's how we connected.
Any last word of advice or wisdom?
That broad question. I'll give you a broad answer. The best piece of advice I've ever given or I've ever received in my career, I got when I was 22 years old. And it was to always chase experiences, never chase salary, never chase title. Like a lot of things we discussed today, salary and title are lagging measures of the experiences that you bring and the value that you bring. So if you expose yourself to different experiences, you will personally grow from that time, and you'll be able to bring more value to whatever you do in life.
I love it. A great way to end our conversation today. Well, thank you so much, Matt, for taking some time out of your busy day to speak with me today.
Oh, it was a pleasure, Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the EX Podcast. If you want to learn more, visit our website at expodcast.com. If you want to find out more about our next conferences, go to exsummit.com. Finally, you can also find my manifesto on business to employee or B2E branding at b2ebranding.co. See you next week.